8. That is the number of cities that served as the capital of the United States before Washington, D.C. was built. Not one previous capital that was tried and found inadequate, not two capitals representing different political eras. 8 separate cities across 5 states that housed the federal government at various points during the first 26 years of the nation's existence. Philadelphia, twice. Baltimore, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, for exactly 1 day. York, Pennsylvania, for 9 months. Princeton, New Jersey. Annapolis, Maryland. Trenton, New Jersey. And New York City, which served as the first capital under the Constitution for 5 years before the government finally moved to a city that did not yet exist when the decision to build it was made. 8 capitals, 26 years. A government that could not find a permanent home, or more precisely, a government that kept losing its home because the homes it occupied turned out to be locations it could not adequately defend from the people it governed. I found this while researching the land grant records of the District of Columbia, trying to understand how the federal government acquired the territory on which Washington was built, who had been living on that land before the federal government decided it needed to be a capital, what was paid for it, to whom, and under what circumstances. I expected to find a straightforward story about federal land acquisition in the early republic, the kind of administrative history that fills the footnotes of the period without ever making it into the main narrative. What I found instead was a question that the administrative history was designed not to ask, the question of why. Not why a permanent capital was needed. That part is obvious. But why this particular location? Why this specific piece of ground on the boundary between Maryland and Virginia? Why a government that was already operating from Philadelphia, which had been the capital of the colonies and the meeting place of both the Continental Congress and the Constitutional Convention, decided that Philadelphia was inadequate, and that what was needed was an entirely new city built from nothing in a location that had no existing infrastructure, no established commercial networks, and a climate that would prove genuinely hostile to the health of the government employees who lived and worked there. The official story answers that question with the Hamilton-Jefferson Compromise of 1790. Hamilton needed Northern votes in Congress to pass his plan for the federal government to assume the war debts of the individual states. Jefferson needed a Southern location for the permanent capital to prevent the commercial interests of Northern cities from exerting excessive influence over the federal government. They made a deal. Hamilton got his debt assumption. Jefferson got his Southern capital. George Washington, as a Virginia landowner with close knowledge of the Potomac region, chose the specific site. Pierre Charles L'Enfant designed the city. Construction began. The government moved there in 1800. The compromise worked. The rest is history. That story is accurate as far as it describes the political mechanics of a specific legislative negotiation. What it does not describe is why the political negotiation took the form it did. Why the compromise involved building an entirely new city rather than simply relocating the existing government to an existing southern city. Why the specific location chosen happened to be in a region where George Washington had extensive personal financial interests that would benefit directly from the presence of the federal government, and why the mechanism chosen for acquiring the land for the new capital was structured in a way that transformed the original landowners into financial stakeholders in the success of the project, rather than simply compensating them for what was taken. Let me start with what the 8 previous capitals actually tell us, because the official story compresses them into a footnote so quickly that their significance is lost. The Continental Congress did not move from Philadelphia to Baltimore in December of 1776 because it was searching for a better permanent home. It moved because the British Army was approaching Philadelphia, and the Congress had no military force capable of defending the city where it met. It moved because it was fleeing. The Congress returned to Philadelphia when the military situation improved. It left again in September of 1777, when British forces under General Howe threatened the city for the second time. It moved to Lancaster for 1 day before deciding that Lancaster was also too close to the British lines and continuing to York. It remained in York for 9 months, not because York was a satisfactory capital, Because the military situation did not improve quickly enough to allow a return to Philadelphia. After the war, the pattern of vulnerability continued in a different form. In June of 1783, soldiers of the Continental Army who had not been paid stationed themselves outside the building in Philadelphia where Congress was meeting and demanded their wages. The Congress appealed to Pennsylvania's Executive Council for military protection. The council declined to call out the state militia against the soldiers. The Congress, trapped inside a government building by its own unpaid army, had no independent means of self-defense. After several tense hours, the soldiers dispersed without violence. But the event demonstrated something about the national government that the Constitutional Convention of 1787 would address directly. A government that met in an existing city was subject to the political pressures and physical threats that existed in that city. It was vulnerable to the populations it governed. It was dependent on the goodwill of state governments for its physical protection. It could be surrounded by its own soldiers and have no independent capacity to respond. The Constitutional Convention's solution to this problem is written directly into Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Congress shall have exclusive jurisdiction over a district not exceeding 10 miles square that shall serve as the seat of government, exclusive jurisdiction, not shared jurisdiction with a state government, not jurisdiction subject to the authority of a local executive who might or might not choose to deploy state military forces in defense of federal interests. Exclusive. The federal government alone would govern the district in which it sat. No state government would have authority within the capital's boundaries. No state militia could be ordered to stand down by a state governor when federal interests required protection. The capital was not just relocated. It was constitutionally insulated from the democratic pressures that had made every previous capital inadequate. That is the part of the story that the official narrative compresses into a single sentence about the compromise between Hamilton and Jefferson. Now, here is where it gets strange. The Potomac Company had been chartered by the Virginia and Maryland legislatures in 1784. Its purpose was to develop the Potomac River as a navigable commercial waterway connecting the Atlantic coast ports to the interior of the continent. The development of the Upper Potomac region as a commercial corridor was the company's core business proposition. George Washington was the largest individual shareholder in the Potomac Company. He had invested in it personally. He had advocated publicly for its chartered mission. His financial interests were directly tied to the development of exactly the region where the new federal capital would be located. When Washington was asked, as the first president of the United States, to choose the specific location of the permanent capital within the general Potomac area that the Hamilton-Jefferson Compromise had designated, he chose a location that maximized the developmental benefit to the region where his own investment was concentrated. This is not a contested historical claim. Washington's shareholding in the Potomac Company is documented. His role in selecting the capital's specific location is documented. The relationship between the two facts is documented in the correspondence of the period. What is not emphasized in the standard narrative is what the combination of those two facts means. The first president of the United States used the authority of his office to locate the permanent seat of the federal government in a position that directly benefited his personal investment portfolio. The land acquisition process added another layer. Washington personally negotiated with the private landowners whose property would become the District of Columbia. Many of them were his neighbors, men he had known for decades, men whose social world he occupied and whose interests he understood. The terms he negotiated gave each landowner the option of receiving their compensation either entirely in cash or partially in cash and partially in lots in the new city that would be built on the land they were selling. Most landowners chose the mixed option, which meant that the people who had sold their land to the federal government became holders of lots in the new capital whose value depended entirely on the success of the project they had sold their land to enable. Their financial interests were now aligned with the federal government's interest in making Washington, D.C. a successful and growing city. They had been transformed from people who owned land that the government needed into people who had a stake in the government's project succeeding. The people who did not participate in this arrangement were the people who did not have legal title to the land they occupied, the tenant farmers, the formerly enslaved people who had been farming portions of the district's territory for generations without ever holding formal title. The families whose occupation of the land predated the legal documentation systems that determined whose claim the government would recognize and compensate. These people received nothing, because the land acquisition process was organized around legal title, and they did not have legal title. They had occupation. They had labor invested over decades. They had communities built around shared work on shared land, none of which the legal framework of the period recognized as a compensable interest. They dispersed when the construction began. Their names appear in no founding document of the capital. Their displacement generated no administrative record. They are simply absent from the history of how the city was built. The city was built using the labor of enslaved people. This fact is acknowledged in contemporary historical accounts and is not seriously disputed. The Capitol building, the President's House, the Executive Department buildings, the streets and foundations of the early city were constructed using enslaved labor hired out by their owners to the federal government. The government paid the owners. The people doing the work received nothing. Their names appear in the construction records as line items in labor cost accounting, not as people, as costs. The buildings they built are still standing. The city they constructed by force is the seat of the government that claimed to represent the principles of human liberty. The 8 cities that came before Washington tell you what the permanent capital was designed to prevent. A government that could be chased out of its home by armies, that could be surrounded by its own soldiers and have no defense. That depended on the goodwill of state governments for its physical protection. Washington was designed to end all of that. A constitutionally insulated district where the federal government alone had authority, where no state militia could be ordered to stand down, where the government could not be reached by the democratic pressures that had made every previous location inadequate, selected by a president with financial interests in the region, acquired through a process that transformed the sellers into stakeholders, built by people who were never compensated for their labor, and located at a precise distance from the pressures of democracy that the founders had decided a stable government required. The 8 previous capitals are in the history books if you look for them. The constitutional clause establishing exclusive federal jurisdiction over the district is in Article 1. The Potomac Company records are in the archives. The land acquisition negotiations are documented in Washington's correspondence. The construction labor records are in the National Archives. The story of how the permanent American capital was built is entirely documented. It has simply never been told as a single connected account of the interests that shaped each decision and the people who bore the costs of those decisions without having a voice in making them. 8 cities, 26 years, 1 site on the Potomac, and a set of choices made in the 1790s that determined not just where the government would sit, but how thoroughly it would protect itself from the people it was supposed to serve. The city is still there. The constitutional insulation is still there. The records of who paid for it and who was paid for it and who was never paid at all are still there. And the question of whether the permanent capital of the United States was located where it was located because it was best for the country or because it was best for the man who chose its location is a question the official story of American nation building has spent 230 years not asking. If you want more videos like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.